Hey everybody, Tim Ulbrich here, and thank you for listening to the YFP Podcast, where each week we strive to inspire and encourage you on your path towards achieving financial freedom. This week, YFP co-founder, director of financial planning, and certified financial planner, Tim Baker, joins me to answer your top 3 financial questions. During the show, we tackle pros and cons of paying off low interest rate debt versus investing, strategies to optimize student loan repayment for those not pursuing public service loan forgiveness, and how to determine how much one needs to save for retirement. Before we jump into the show, I want to make sure that you're aware of our next YFP open house that I'm hosting on Thursday, March 14th at 8:30 p.m. Eastern. If you're wondering how working one-on-one with a financial planner can help you achieve your financial goals, the best place to begin is by signing up for our open house. You can do so by visiting yourfinancialpharmacist.com/open house. During this open house, we'll help you gain clarity on your vision for living a rich life and how the financial plan can become the engine for achieving that vision. We'll also help you determine how much is enough when it comes to retirement planning, whether or not you're on track. I'll be taking the group through a nest egg calculation. You can learn about the nuts and bolts of hiring a financial planner, including what to look for, different types of planners that are available, and why fee-only planning matters. And finally, we'll cover an overview of YFP services, including our financial planning and tax and accounting services. Make sure to sign up to attend live. We won't be recording this workshop. For those that attend, they'll receive an interactive workbook as well as a free resource, Where Should My Next Dollar Go?, that will help you assess your overall financial well-being and provide clarity on how to efficiently deploy cash, avoid overspending, and prioritize various goals. Again, you can register for this open house on Thursday, March 14th at 8:30 p.m. Eastern by visiting yourfinancialpharmacist.com/open house. All right, let's jump into today's episode. Hi there, Tim Ulbrich here. Welcome to this week's episode of the YFP Podcast. I'm excited to welcome Tim Baker back to the mic as we're going to put him on the hot seat with some rapid fire Q&A from some of those common questions that we get from our community, including those around debt repayment, investment, and retirement planning. Tim, it's been a while since we've had you on the show. What's new? What's exciting?
What's new? We're in the throes of tax season, so we're busy there. I'm talking to a lot of potential clients coming on board. Baby number 3 is about a month away,
Woo-hoo!
Tim, so we're preparing for that. I joke we have about 1,000 projects before that we have to complete before the baby gets here. So I'm kind of maneuvering my wife's list here. So, but yeah, all good things, no complaints.
Well, we're excited to jump into these questions. No, it's a busy season for you, busy season here for YFP, as you mentioned, in the midst of tax season. And, we'll talk at the end of this episode about our YFP Plus community, our new community that we've been offering now for a few months. And it's been really exciting to see the questions and the engagement that group has, and one another jumping in, answering those questions. And we wanted to pull 3 of the most common questions that we get, whether it's inside of that community, whether it's Tim, questions that we get when we're speaking that come up on repeat. And so they may be variations of these, but common questions around things like, hey, how much do I need to have saved for retirement? What are the pros and cons of paying off debt versus investing? That's probably the most common question that we get. And, what should I do with my student loans, and how can I best optimize the repayment strategy? So let's jump into these one by one. Tim, the first question that we have is a big one, but how much do I need to save in order to retire? How much is enough? And how do I begin to determine what that number is?
Yeah, so I mean, it depends. Just got to get that out of the way, right? I mean, this is such a multivariable thing. I think it's just really hard to determine, without a, pretty deep level analysis, to be honest, Tim. I know, I'll talk through some rules of thumb here and things like that. But, like I was talking to a couple last night, and, I think the wife, the pharmacist, was like, I kind of want the same level of comfort in retirement that I have today in terms of my standard to live in. And the husband and the spouse was like, I could live in a tent and be completely content, so that's a big thing, like if what your need is in retirement, you could have enough saved today, Tim. Like it really don't know. So the variables there, some of the variables could be, the standard to live in, the time in retirement. There's a lot of clients that we work with that like will say like, hey, like I don't know how long I'm going to be around because of
Yep.
my family history. So we put that in play. Taxes, inflation, unexpected, expenses. A lot of that could be medical. Um, Even the inability to work. So there, a lot of people when they're doing this calculus, they'll say, "Oh, I'll work till 70, or
Yep.
I'll work part time." And the stats say that 40% of the people out there are gonna stop working earlier than they think that they do. So what I always do, there's lots of fancy ways to kind of calculate this. And if you've ever heard of Monte Carlo analysis, this is where we simulate portfolio returns, thousands of simulations, and say with X% probability of success. We typically want anywhere
Mm-hmm.
of from 70 to 80% probability of success. You might say, Tim, why not 100%? Typically, if we're lower than 70%, we're going to adjust the plan accordingly in real time to get it to the end of that. So I think the best thing that, and we've done this a lot, and when we speak, Tim, the best, I think, way to determine if we're on track to retire is to do a nest egg,
Mm-hmm.
a nest egg calculation. And this was really born out of, Tim, like back in the day when I started advising people on their retirement stuff. What I learned from a mentor is we would say, hey, based on these assumptions, you need $3.5 million to retire. And then we would just move on to the next thing.
Yep.
And I would see the look in people's eyes where like that number just didn't hit the
Mm-hmm.
mark at all. Like it was just like it was kind of equated to like student loans where it's just like monopoly money that doesn't make any sense to me at all. So what I started to do is I would take that number and then I would kind of use another time value of money calculation to discount it back to
Yeah.
a number. So if you're the client, Tim, a number for Tim in 2024 that actually is digestible to you, that's palatable to you, that says, okay, like that makes sense. And typically what we're doing is that we're comparing what you're putting into your 401k, your IRAs, what you already have, what your allocation is, so we can kind of make some assumptions on performance returns, how long you're going to work, and then we can say, hey, you're on track by this amount of dollars per month, or you're off track by this
Mm-hmm.
amount of dollars per month. And obviously that hill gets steeper if we're off track the closer that we get to our target. So to me, that's a huge thing to actually connect the dots to. Like when I ask people, like, are they on track? A lot of people will say, I have no idea, or they'll say like, oh, I'm using a calculator. That typically is not a great
Yep.
indicator of where they're at. So, but I think a lot of this goes back to kind of, move the answer forward is like, what do you need? A lot of the estimates will say, um, a lot of retirement planners will say, hey, you need 70 to 80% of your pre-retirement income in retirement. And that's typically the reason for that is like you're typically saving 20-30% of your income pre-retirement, like so leading up to the years of retirement. Um, and you're not doing that in retirement. So, but a lot of that, Tim, also misses the mark, right? Because it's like, all right, well, if I'm like 20-30 years from retirement, what does that even mean to me?
That's right.
But if you
Yep.
take, I did a kind of an example here. If you're making 125,000 today and you have a 30-year career ahead of you and you get a 3% cost of living adjustment every year, in 30 years, that equals $303,000 and $303,000, 400. So
Almost hard to
seven,
believe, right? When you put those
yeah,
numbers that, yeah,
yep. But then if you look back 30 years, like look back at like what the
totally.
cost of like a house was, or like what you know what I mean? Like, so you have to, it's perspective, right? So 30% of that 303 is about $212. So essentially what you need is $212 for 30 straight years. So every year, $212. And then we have to, account for inflation and things like that. So
212,000.
212,000.
Yep.
Right. So you need a portfolio. So if you just do it in simple terms, 212 times 30, like that's kind of like,
Mm-hmm.
that's a very, linear way to look at it. But then you have to, factor in things, like variable expenses and things like that. So what a lot of people will point to, which I don't love it because I think it can steer people wrong, but I think it at least gets like a foundation of where to think about this is the 4% rule. So
Mm-hmm.
the 4% rule is you can withdraw 4% of your savings in the first year of retirement, adjusting for inflation every year thereafter to ensure that you're saving, you have enough saved for 30 years. So the way to kind of backwards plan to that is if you multiply your annual retirement expenses. So let's say you need let's say you need $60,000 per year. Let's say 20,000 of that comes from Social Security. Then we need 40,000. 40,000 times 25 years. So we're just doing the 4% inverted
Mhm.
is $1 million, or $1 million times, 0.044% is that $40,000. So that's a way to look at it. But again, like, I don't know if that does a great job of, planning for longevity.
Yeah.
There's a lot of errors in that, in that assumption, but I think it's a good place to start thinking about this. So, I mean, it's a really big question that has a lot of, at any time that you look at something over, 20, 30 years. Again, if you're closer to this, maybe the question is a little bit easier to answer, but looking at expenses, looking at budget, the budget never goes away. I know people are like, oh, budget, scenario analysis. I
Yeah.
think all of those things kind of play into this.
Yeah, and Tim, this is why I love, as you mentioned, the nest egg exercise. You can see the connections that people start to make in that exercise. Now, of course, especially if we're looking over a long horizon, right? 20, 30 years out, or even if it's 10 years out, like things are going to change. This is not a one and done, type of thing we got to be looking at on a regular basis. But when you're able to take people from that overwhelming shock number, right? 3 million, 4 million, 5 million, to, as you said, okay, here's what we need to be doing this year and actually this month. Like, this is what we need to be doing based on what we have saved, based on a set of assumptions that we obviously have to think through and think about risk tolerance, capacity, all those kinds of things, based on what we choose to assume or not with Social Security, based on what you're getting through your employer. All of these things are going to feed into where are we at currently and what do we need to be doing per month. And, I did this recently during a open house that we did in February, and I'll be doing it again at our next open house coming up on March 14th. Again, you can register for that at yourfinancialpharmacist.com/open house. And what's fascinating about that is I can see this come to life when people start to just see how these numbers are calculated and see the assumptions in place, because again, we're actually making it mean something to today, right? When we look at a number per month, we can start to see how that does or doesn't fit in with the budget. We might not like that number, but we can start to actually work with that. And in fact, sometimes we find out through this exercise that people are over saving, and there's a conversation to be had there about, hey, how do we feel about it? What other goals are happening? And might we shift around, different priorities? And then you can toggle some of these factors. Like, hey, I said I wanted to retire at 67, but what happens if it's 62 or 58? Or, hey, I like the work that I'm doing, and I don't really see myself going from full-time to nothing for 30 years. What if I'm working part-time and having an income? And these change things significantly when you look at these calculations.
Yeah, I mean, if I do say so myself, I think it's a great tool.
Yeah, it is.
I think it was born out of like the misconnection between that big number in the future and what we're doing today. And I think, to your point, like, being able to like toggle those levers and pull those
Mhm.
levers, whether it's working longer, working less, dialing back things, dialing up things. Like, I think it's really cool to see. And to your point, yeah, we've had a lot of clients that have definitely, we talk about, living a wealthy life today, and will live in a wealthy life tomorrow.
Yeah.
Sometimes the calculus shows that they're really focused on living a wealthy life tomorrow in spite of today, meaning
Yeah.
like, and I think it's rare for a financial planner to say like, hey, you're saving too much for retirement. But I do think that push and pull between today and tomorrow is really important. So like, let's focus on that trip to wherever. Let's focus
Mhm.
on, that, down payment for a real estate property or whatever that is. Like those things, I think, have to be part of the plan as well. So, yeah, it's a great question to ask. It's just really hard to answer without, a lot of detail, a lot of, what's the balance sheet look like,
Yeah.
what are the goals, and going from there.
Yeah, and if listeners want to dig deeper on this topic, first, love to have you join us at the open house. Second, we've covered this as a standalone topic on the podcast before, at episode 272. Tim and I talked about how much is enough. How do you determine that? We'll link to that to show notes. Make sure to check out that episode as well. All right, second question we have, as I mentioned before, probably the most common question that I know I get when I'm presenting is, hey, what are the pros and cons of paying off low interest debt, such as a student loan or auto loan, versus investing? Furthermore, how do you think about prioritizing strategies for paying down debt, saving for retirement, and saving for a house down payment? Tim, I'll add to this before you jump in here that this is a really common question that we see, especially among those within that first 10 years of graduation, right? They've got a lot of things that are coming at them. I've got a bunch of student loans. I'm looking at buying a home. You're telling me that I should be investing and saving for the future. I need an emergency fund. How do I begin to prioritize and weigh all these things? And again, before you say it depends, like I think this is an example question where the value of planning is so important because we got to get all those things out of our head on the paper so we can start to plan. So what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I mean, I always look at debt as like a spectrum. I think you have, good debt, which, I would categorize as like a mortgage. I would still put student loan debt in there because, a mortgage is a, typically appreciating asset that you're living in, raise a family. Student loans is typically, the price of doing business to become a pharmacist. Um, higher levels of income, post degree. But then as you go like auto loans, again, these are use assets that are typically depreciating. You're typically paying higher interest than you have in the past, but it serves a function of like getting you to work. Um, but then as you go, it might be things like debt for furniture or other types of personal loans, and then credit card debt is typically at that
Mm-hmm.
other end of the spectrum of bad debt, where it's you're typically this is the purchase of wants, not necessarily needs, or it's there because of a lack of an emergency fund or kind of
Mm-hmm.
planning for those unexpected things. So I think like where you draw the line between good debt and bad debt is going to be different for everybody. Typically it's the car to the right is good debt, so car, student loans, mortgage is
Mm-hmm.
okay, and then everything to the left is not. Some people will put car as like a bad debt. Um, so I think it just depends on what your goals are, what your aspect of debt. I was asked recently by a prospective client about like, hey, was watching something that Dave Ramsey said about paying off, a mortgage that's less than 3%, and he's very paints with a broad brush and said like, really any debt, you're kind of a slave to the master is kind of how he describes it. Um, and I think like there's a psychological thing of this. Like if you feel like that debt is preventing you to be financially free, then I would treat that differently than something else. Like I have no qualms about sitting on my 2.5%
Mm-hmm.
mortgage for 30 years. I just don't. Um, so I think if we look at this, like the pros of paying off debt versus investing, the paying off debt is a guaranteed return,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if your debt is 6%, that's, you're not necessarily going to get that in the market consistently. So it's a guaranteed, return. I think it reduces financial stress. So eliminating debt can reduce stress and kind of simplify your finances. You do, I think, if you are completely debt free, I think you operate differently. You think of you look at the world a little bit differently than if you have multiple liabilities that's kind of weighing on you. And then we see this with student loans, Tim, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like
Mm-hmm.
I feel suffocated because I have this $200,000 in debt. Um, the cons of paying off debt, I think, is the opportunity cost of like what you might miss in terms of like if you were to invest that, especially if the interest rates are really low, and then just kind of just overall money, less money for investments. The pros, I think, of investing is potentially higher returns, although not guaranteed,
Mm-hmm.
compounding growth, potential tax benefits if you're putting into things like 401ks and IRAs. The cons are, again, market risk. There's no guarantee. And you know, complexity. Like, if you're just paying off debt, a lot of people will make investing more interesting or sexier than it needs to be. I look at it at investing as it should be super boring, but not everyone does that. A lot of people don't do that. So that's kind of there is no right or wrong answer. I kind of have my own biases. When I'm working with a client, I'll look at their risk tolerance. I'll look at what their goals are. I'll look at like, what are they saying to me? If they're saying things like, this debt keeps me up at night, I'm going to treat that very differently than if someone's like, like it's whatever. But there is a mathematical component to that as well. In terms of prioritizing financial strategies, or just get the financial, like, what do we do, for paying down debt versus saving. You know, I was speaking to a prospective client the other day, and they have real estate, they have some investments, they have a brokerage account, no emergency fund. So like we're doing steps 6, 7, and 8 before
Yeah.
we're doing step one, really. So building an emergency fund, having a high yield savings account with those non-discretionary, I think expenses just stowed away. Super important. That's a foundational thing. I think from there, it's also like the consumer debt. So like credit cards,
Mm-hmm.
furniture debt, whatever that looks like, I think is really important because it's typically higher interest that you want to get out from underneath. I would also put taking advantage of the employer match up there. Like, most of the time, I think that is really, really important to get the free money. Still see people that don't take advantage of
Yeah.
that. And then I think looking at higher interest debt, paying that off. So, maybe that is a car. We're seeing, car rates. I think you mentioned it in YFP Plus community, just what those rates are. Shocking. They're high. So
High
again,
sevens right now.
yeah,
Yeah.
I would pay that off before I would go into the market.
Mhm.
So I think that to me, and again, like the one thing that the questioner it's like, what about saving for retirement? Again, I kind of look at get the match, and then I look at it as that as you are navigating these other things. To me, in the back of your mind, it should be a race to 10%. Like get the match, which may be 5%, but then you really want to get to 10% as quickly as possible, and then assess from there. And I think, like, to me, saving for a house down payment, that's a really tough one to prioritize, Tim, because
Yeah.
oftentimes with this one, like you rationalize it, you rationalize your decision. So like it's a super emotional decision. Once you start going down the path of looking at houses, um, being a Zillow warrior, actually going to houses, like those timelines get cut overnight. And I
Mm-hmm.
always joke, like I was talking to a prospective client and they were like, yeah, I want to buy a house in the next 2 or 3 years. And I talked to them 2 weeks
Mm-hmm.
later and they were under contract.
Yeah.
Um, so to me, like if that's important for you, I would put that to the top, put that at the top of the list, and prioritize that. I think what sometimes happens, Tim, is that we try to do a lot we try to do a little bit of a lot of things versus a lot of like one or two things.
Yeah.
So I think working with a planner to help you prioritize is going to be really important. And it's hard to do. Sometimes it's hard to do that when you're stuck inside your own head, or
Mm-hmm.
even with like a spouse. So sometimes that that third party objective viewpoint to help you guide that conversation, I think, is important. But again, there's really no right or wrong answer here. It's just tailoring to, like, when I say it depends, what I mean by that is, it depends on what your balance sheet are, like what your balance sheet looks like and what
Yeah.
your goals are. And unfortunately, you can't like look at a neighbor, a colleague, because like you're going to be different. You are a unique snowflake. So, your experience, your life experience, your finances are going to be different than everybody else's. And I think, developing a plan that navigates that is super important.
Yeah, Tim, the visual that comes to mind as you're talking, and I alluded to this when I asked the question, is, we so often live with all of these competing priorities that are swirling in our minds, right? Guilty as charged. And it really is a step that often is hard work, but it's really important. I think this is where a third party can be so helpful for us to kind of get out of our own way, make sure we're looking at all the factors, making sure we're not thinking of things in a silo. But it's like we got to put all the puzzle pieces out. We got to get them out of the box so we can start to figure out how they actually come together. And then to implement the plan, looking at our cash flow, looking at our goals and things to actually begin to execute on that. But we tend to go into execution mode without really considering all the pieces and parts and how they impact one another. And this sounds easy, but it's not, right? In this question, we're thinking about paying down debt, and that could be more than one type of debt. We're thinking about, hey, when might we buy a home? We think about saving for retirement. When you look at the percentage of take home pay that these things will take up, it is huge. These are
Yeah.
these are big decisions, and we're not even talking about other types of goals, right? Vacation, travel, what else is going on the financial plan. So I feel like there is such an important step here of before you start running in any one direction. Hey, let's get all of this down on the paper. You did this with Jess and I back in the day. Like, let's create a prioritized list of these.
Yeah.
What's the target? What's the goal? How much do we need? What priority? How much per month? And then we start to actually create the buckets and the mechanism, the thing to actually make these come to life. And when you're doing that and you're automating that, I can't even adequately describe the feelings that come when you know that that system is in place working for you.
Yeah, and I think like to go back to the first question, like we've had conversations with clients that like, they're saving much for retirement, and they're like, we can actually do a little bit less to then get into the house sooner,
Mm,
right? So like if you think about it, like my my pop back in the day, like he had a pension. There was no such thing as 401ks,
right.
like all of these other things that have like made financial, even my parents, like it's very different. Now you go into the workforce and you have 30,000 things that are like vying for
Yeah.
your attention and your dollars. And it's just different than what it was before. And now like the onus, especially on retirement, is up to you versus like your employer. But it's also like a lot of the advice that you're getting is from like the old generation of like, hey, buy a house, make sure you're saving for retirement. And those are all good things, but the world is different now. And I'm
Yeah.
not saying that like that's bad advice, but like you gotta kind of have to like, walk to your own tune, so to speak. And I think like a lot of people get anxiety because they're like, oh, I'm not doing enough here. I'm not doing enough here. And, I think like if you're doing a plan, you're doing enough, right?
Hmm.
And I think part of the great thing about plan is that you are slowing down in the day to day of like busy living and objectively looking
Yes.
at your situation and reflecting,
Hmm.
self-reflecting, or we're forcing you to reflect of like, hey, are we on the track that we're supposed to be on? And also to like celebrate the wins. Like, when
Yep.
we start with a client, the first two meetings that we go through is what we call get organized, where we're building out a nice clean balance sheet of all the assets that we own minus all the liabilities that we owe. That's our first data points. Think of that as like the before picture. And then the second meeting is all we call script your plan, is all about, okay, now that we know where we're at, where are we going? So let's talk about, you want to buy a house, you want to have a family, you want to be able to retire at this age, you want to be able to build your real estate empire, you want to be able to do X, Y, and Z. And once we have those two foundational things in place, the answer it depends then transforms to, this is what I think you should do because I know what your balance
Recommendations.
sheet looks
Yes.
like, I
Hmm.
know what your goals are, and this is the the objective advice that we think is in your best interest. So like that's going to be different for everyone. And I
Hmm.
think like that, tracking that from data point one to 2 years, 3 years in the future, we start to see quantifiably the benefit. We think, net worth is the best measure of that, the benefit from a net worth perspective, but then also the qualitative benefits of like,
Yes.
wow, like I took that trip, I am spending more time with my family, like we had a
Yep.
family sooner than I thought, we bought the house. I thought it was going to take us 5 years, we did it in less time. So to me, those are the benefits of again working on a plan, working with a planner
Hmm.
to help prioritize all these things, right? Because we talk about this in the tax world. We feel that working with one of our CFPs and a CPA side by side and stacking years of intentional financial planning, intentional tax planning will get you to where you need to be quicker.
Yep.
But I was working talking to one of our planning clients that's considering tax, and they have a tax person, but they're just, and it's a question of filing separately and filing
Hmm.
jointly. They're just looking at it from the perspective of tax. They're not thinking about how the filing status affects the student loan payment.
Yep.
So to me, you can't look at these things in a vacuum. They're all interconnected. And I think as you go, that becomes, more true and more obvious. So again, I'm biased though, right?
No, it's great stuff. And that's why I'm glad you brought up the quantitative, qualitative stuff, because yes, it translates into actual dollars and cents. Net worth is the indicator that we're, looking at most assets, what you own, minus liabilities, what you owe. But it also is the qualitative stuff. Are we achieving that living a rich life? And also, as I alluded to, just the mental clarity and the peace of mind that comes from like, I know that I've thought about these, or I know that me and my partner or spouse have thought about these together, and we have a plan. Like, it's hard to put a
Yeah.
dollar amount to that, but that really is incredible. And for folks that want to learn more about our one-on-one financial planning service, you can go to yfpplanning.com. Love to have a conversation with you to learn more about that service, learn more about what you have going on in your own individual plan, and see whether or not that service is a good fit. Again, yfpplanning.com. From there, you can click on the link to book a free discovery call. All right, Tim, question number 3. If PSLF, public service loan forgiveness, is not an option for me, what should I do with $200,000 of student loans? How do I weigh paying them off versus pursuing 20 to 25 years of forgiveness, which would then result in what others call the tax bomb? So what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, and again, forgive the continued commercial, Tim, but like I think when you're dealing with 6 figures worth of debt, $200,000, I do think some type of an analysis is really important, especially with like the moving goalposts that are the student loan repayment plans and
Mm-hmm.
the strategies that are out there. Um, so I think, this is a math equation that it comes from the analysis, but I think you have to also overlay how you feel about the debt,
Yeah.
right? So again, if you're like, ugh, like I need to get through this like ASAP, like it's a weight on me versus like, like it is what it is. I think that with the math equation is going to color how like I would advise you as your planner. So I would say back in the day, when we would look at a potentially non-PSLF, strategy. So just to remind everyone, PSLF, was implemented in 2007,
Yeah.
and so that means that the first time someone was able to be forgiven was 2017. So you had to work. Your loans had to be federal. You had to be in the right type of repayment plan. You had to work for a nonprofit, 501c3, the government. You paid, 10 years worth of payments, didn't have to be consecutive, and then you were forgiven tax free. Um, you're eligible for forgiveness. You're still eligible for forgiveness outside of PSLF. We call it non PSLF. The It's a little bit different. You still have to have the right loans and the right plan. It doesn't matter who you work for. So you can work for a for-profit,
Mm-hmm.
but instead of paying it for 10 years, you are paying it for 20 or 25 years if they're graduate loans. And then that forgiveness amount is taxable in the year of forgiveness, whereas PSLF, it's a tax-free event. So in before the new plan, the save plan, typically the calculus was if your debt to income ratio was higher than 2 to 1.
Mm-hmm.
So meaning I made 100,000 and I had $300,000 in debt. My debt to income ratio was 3 to 1 in that case. Then a non PSLF strategy was on the table, because by the time we looked at 300,000 in a standard or even a refi, by the time we looked at that compared to an income driven plan plus a couple $100 or whatever that was invested for a tax bomb, what you paid per month and what you paid in total was less than what you would pay in a
Yeah.
standard. Now with the save plan and the payments a little bit different, it's changed a little bit. So I would say that, and the other thing that's changed too, Tim, is that, we're if we were looking at non PSLF, we were also looking at like typically a refi. So like
Mm-hmm.
if our rates were 6% weighted, you might be able to go out and for the same 10 year find a 4.5
Yeah.
or 5%. So you would get a little bit of a better rate. That's changed too, right? So now what we're having to weigh is a non PSLF strategy versus staying in the federal system with potentially a better interest rate, but me just maybe keeping the standard
Mm-hmm.
plan. So if you have $200,000 in debt, the standard plan is going to be $2,171 for 10 years. So I think the play here is potentially looking at a refi, which I don't know if you're necessarily going to beat. I would look at a 10 year. If you can go a little bit more aggressive, 7 year, 5 year, but your payment's going to go up accordingly.
Yeah.
So again, the goalposts have changed a little bit here. I would say that, I would say that probably a non PSLF strategy here. If I'm assuming you're making 125, 130 is probably not the way to go. So probably something in the standard, maybe even being more aggressive in the standard, or again, looking at refis if rates come down. I'm not sure what the 10-year, if you do an apples to apples, but there are still benefits to staying in the federal that I would want there to be a pretty significant interest rate decrease for me to move off into a private loan, and that's irreversible. So before, Tim, we would just say, hey, this is kind of the rules of thumb. This is the way to look at it, but it's a lot different because of the new save plan, the interest rates, et cetera. I think that's basically where we're at today.
Yeah, I think as you pointed out, the income of this individual is a really important piece of information
Yes.
we don't have, right? Because if they're making 180 versus they're making 95, that's going to impact that debt to income ratio. And to your point with the new save plan, that ratio in effect has gotten more favorable. What I mean by that is because of the change in the plan, the debt to income threshold could potentially be lower, and it might make sense to pursue a non-PSLF pathway. And let's zoom back out, right? We've been kind of preaching on not getting into these silo types of decisions. When you're talking about, hey, do we go more aggressive? Do we not? That gets back to conversations about cash flow. What does the budget actually support? What other goals are in mind? Are we someone who graduated in their mid to late 20s, or is this someone that pharmacy is a second career and they're behind on investing in retirement? All of those things, just a few examples, are going to impact, right, what decision we make with the student loans and how it ties into other decisions that are happening in the financial plan. So, Tim, great stuff. These are just a few of the types of questions and conversations that we are seeing inside of our new online community called YFP Plus. If you're not already familiar with YFP Plus, we'd love to have you check out that community. Inside, you'll find exclusive on-demand courses. We've got weekly live events. We have monthly themes and challenges. So, for example, this past month in February, we were talking all about preparing for Uncle Sam and taxes, bringing in Sean, our CPA, into the community. For the month of March, it's all about FIRE, financial independence, retire early. We've got several events lined up throughout the month. The space to ask questions of our financial planners and our tax professionals, and to be in a community of other like-minded individuals. It's really an incredible community. We hope you'll check it out and use our 30-day free trial to determine whether or not it's a good long-term fit for you. You can do that at going to yourfinancialpharmacist.com/membership to get more information on YFP Plus. Again, yourfinancialpharmacist.com/membership. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next week. Take care. As we conclude this week's podcast, an important reminder that the content on this show is provided to you for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information in the podcast and corresponding material should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial products. We urge listeners to consult with a financial advisor with respect to any investment. Furthermore, the information contained in our archived newsletters, blog posts, and podcasts is not updated and may not be accurate at the time you listen to it on the podcast. Opinions and analyses expressed herein are solely those of your financial pharmacist unless otherwise noted, and constitute judgments as of the dates published. Such information may contain forward-looking statements which are not intended to be guarantees of future events. Actual results could differ materially from those anticipated in the forward-looking statements. For more information, please visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thank you again for your support of the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast. Have a great rest of your week.